My name is Wes Williams. I'm Professor of French Literature here at the University of Oxford. I'm also the Director of Torch. And it's my enormous pleasure to welcome people back for this, the first book at lunchtime of this academic year. And in fact, one of the first book at lunchtimes we've had since we were all confined and did things online. So it's really nice to see people in a room here to think about a book. For those of you who are new to Book at Lunchtime, it's one of Torch's longest standing flagship events. The podcasts and videos of all our previous discussions are a popular feature of the website and the YouTube channel, and indeed we'll be filming today. It's part of our public engagement with research remit. It's also part of what we try and do in Torch, which is to bring people from different areas of academic life together to discuss a particular book or a particular theme or question. Today we're privileged to welcome Stephanie Dalley and panel to discuss The City of Babylon. We have two more stimulating works to discuss later in this term, weeks 5 and 7. We're taking a pause in week 3. In week 5, we have Caroline Larrington's All Men Must Die, which folk who... What's the programme? I've forgotten the programme now. It's the... filmed in Northern Ireland, medieval battles and all the rest. Game of Thrones. There we are. Caroline has explored Game of Thrones in relation to medieval writing. She'll be here to discuss that book. And in week 7, we return to the cities theme, but this time very contemporary, with Max Smith's book, Paris and the Parasite, which looks at contemporary Parisian street art in particular, but also, again, thinks about Paris as a kind of global crossroads of all sorts of different civilizations coming together. Visit our website to find out more about other upcoming Torch events, and that will keep you... You can also join to sign up for the new Torch newsletter, which will keep you informed of everything that's going across the entirety of what we do. Today, Book at Lunchtime, The City of Babylon. I'll start with our author, Stephanie Dalley. She's one of the most renowned British scholars of the ancient Near East. Stephanie was formerly a Fellow of the Oriental Institute here at Oxford, where she taught Akkadian and Sumerian for almost 3 decades. Of The City of Babylon, a number of very, very strongly complementary but also scholarly strong things have been said. For example, this detailed history, drawing on fascinating ancient texts and the archaeology of the site, is valuable reading for anyone wanting to get to grips with ancient Babylon. It's also been called an excellent work, highly recommended. I'm not going to try and summarize the work, but I will just say a few sentences, and that is that the 2,000-year story of Babylon sees it, as this book shows, moving from a city-state to the center of a great empire of the ancient world. It remained a center of kingship under the empires of Assyria, Nebuchadnezzar, Darius, Alexander the Great, the Seleucids, and the Parthians. Its city walls were declared to be a wonder of the world, whilst its ziggurat won fame as, one of the candidates for at least, the Tower of Babel. Babylon was also renowned for its scholarship and literary work throughout the ancient world. Some of these works provide a backdrop to the Old Testament and Hittite texts, and its science also laid the foundations for Greek and Arab astronomy through a millennium of continuous astronomical observations. All this and more is explored in Stephanie's book, and we're privileged to be discussing this work by one of the world's leading authorities and to have an expert panel to provide their insights. A few words on the panel then. I'll start on the far side. Professor Paul Collins. Paul Collins is Jaleh Hearn Curator of Ancient Near East in the Department of Antiquities at the Ashmolean here in Oxford, and is currently also Hugh Price Fellow at Jesus College. He holds a supernumerary fellowship at Wolfson College. In other words, he's an expert in the field. He has worked previously as a curator in the Middle East Department of the British Museum and Ancient Near Eastern Department of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. He received his PhD from the Institute of Archaeology, University of London, and a PGCE from London University's Institute of Education. An expert in the field, in other words, who's also been involved in teaching and public engagement with this kind of work. He's currently chair of the British Institute for the Study of Iraq. Welcome, Paul. Also on our panel, directly on my left, we have Tom Holland. Tom Holland is an award-winning historian, biographer, and broadcaster. He's the author of Rubicon, The Triumph and the Tragedy of the Roman Republic, Persian Fire, his history of the Greco-Persian Wars, and Millennium, the End of the World and the Forging of Christendom, amongst other works. This latter is a panoramic account of the 2 centuries of either side of the apocalyptic year 1000, what one of my authors, Rabelais, calls a climacteric. In the Shadow of the Sword, another work which covers the collapse of the Roman and Persian power in the Near East and the emergence of Islam, and then finally, for now, Dynasty, a portrait of Rome's first imperial dynasty. Tom, if I may, has adapted Homer, Herodotus, Thucydides and Virgil for the BBC, and in 2007 he was the winner of the Classical Association Prize, awarded to the individual who has done most to promote the study of the language, literature and civilization of ancient Greece and Rome. In other words, Tom is our more expert generalist for the panel. We always have somebody who's more specifically in the area of the book itself, and then somebody who can think more broadly about the questions they raise. What I'm going to do then is invite Paul, first of all, to say some words. Stephanie's job for now is to listen. I suggest that we wait for both speakers to speak and then for you to respond to each in turn after that, if that's okay. Just so that we're not doubling up too much. That our experience suggests that's the best way to go.
Do you want my readings?
Yes, and that's what I was going to say. We could start with your reading initially. Do you have 1 or 2 readings?
I've got 2.
Okay. In that case, can we start with 1?
We'll start with 1.
Yes, and then have some discussion, and then come back to the second. Thank you so much. We should always, of course, start with the words themselves. So I'll start by inviting Stephanie to read from the book.
So my first reading for the day comes from the time of Hammurabi the Great's son, Samsu-iluna, and shortly after he came to the throne, there was an enormous rebellion. Shortly before the Great Rebellion, Samsu-iluna, that's the name of the king, had received a petition from the people of Uruk in the form of an oracle. It presented a request from the goddess Nanaya to relieve the city of the grain tax, revealing discontent with the current level of taxation and flattering the king as a faithful shepherd when he visited the ancient temple, assuring him that his presence there would bring him good fortune and long life if he remitted the tax. The oracle emanated from the palace in Uruk and shows that the economy was of central concern. After the Great Rebellion was quelled, clay tablets are no longer found in the cities of southern Babylonia, nor have foundation inscriptions been retrieved from temples and palaces in the south. Such a striking absence, by comparison with the wealth of finds for the period before the rebellion, has led to the inference that the southern cities were totally abandoned for the following 2 centuries or more, some say 400 years. Were they abandoned? Did refugees flood into the northern cities, bringing the remnants of their cults with them? Or can the gap in evidence be explained in other ways, as some recent discoveries appear to show? And I think I'll stop there, because that gives you an idea of how major changes in the understanding of history of this place have changed our views enormously.
Thank you. It also gives us a strong point of loss to start with, which is an interesting place to start thinking about an ancient civilization. Over to you, if I may, Paul.
Thank you very much. This is an extraordinary book. I think because, picking up on that notion of loss, I think it's worth thinking about what this book isn't as much as what it is, because we think we know Babylon. It's a name, of course, that resonates so strongly in people's minds, and this was certainly true from antiquity, after Babylon itself ceased to exist. And so we have echoes of this city in the biblical sources and in the classical sources, which meant that when the Western world came to think about it as a real place, they thought about it as something of a hybrid between Egyptian, Greek, and perhaps even sort of the Ottoman Empire fused together in some exciting way. And of course, those stories that did survive around Babylon gave it a particular feel. The biblical text talked about its debauchery and sin, so it was immediately compelling to artists and writers. And of course, mention famous monuments like the Tower of Babel, which again picked up by artists like Bruegel, or other stories like the harlot, the whore of Babylon, picked up by artists like Dürer. So we start to see an image of Babylon being created in the Western mind, which takes a very strong root. And this was, of course, all before scientific excavations. And even when those excavations started in the 19th century, it was really those earlier accounts of Babylon that caught the imagination of the archaeologists. Some of the earliest excavations began in the early 19th century, but these were really rather exploratory, just digging holes in the ground, surveying the remains of architectural features, because Babylon itself, the site, had never been lost. It was known to the local inhabitants, filled, as one Arabic historian records, filled with snakes and scorpions, so you didn't venture there. But Western explorers, ambassadors, diplomats, adventurers, soldiers in the 19th century began to explore those ruins. And by the late 19th century, archaeologists, including those digging for the British Museum around 1890, began to recover objects and sent them home, places like the British Museum in London. So Babylon became a physical reality, but still very fragmentary remains. And the major excavations which really brought Babylon to life took place in the late 19th, early 20th century, 1899 to 1917, when German archaeologists, led by Robert Koldewey, used vast numbers of local people to dig enormous holes in Babylon and uncovered some remarkable architectural remains, most famously of all the so-called Ishtar Gate, the glazed bricks, or at least some of the glazed bricks, on display in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin. So here's a new monument, a marvelous monument that still resonated all those stories from earlier. Later work in the 50s and 60s, again by Germans, and then teams from Italy continued to explore the site. And indeed, the Iraqis themselves have done huge amount of both excavation but also restoration at Babylon, turning the site into a tourist attraction, which it certainly was until recent conflicts, and is once again, I'm happy to say, becoming a centre for tourism, exploring the largely reconstructed remains, many of which have been put back together by Saddam Hussein. So Babylon continues to resonate deeply in both local as well as international thought. But this is a story which has been the one that's been told about Babylon. A story that was told, for example, in 2008 in 3 major exhibitions. London, Paris, Berlin, all put on exhibitions about Babylon. But it was that Babylon of the discoveries of the Germans and the Greeks and the biblical texts that were the focus for these shows. And the end result of this, I think, is what you can find if you go onto Wikipedia and type in Babylon. And I did so, and the name Babylon, I can tell you, is used for 4 films, 4 movies, 2 TV series, some of which are science fiction, 3 novels, 3 music bands, heavy rock in one case, and an opera, 7 music albums, and 27 songs are all called Babylon, one by Lady Gaga, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. So that's the Babylon as known to the world. What this book does instead is looks at it for its reality, teasing out from the fragmentary, cuneiform texts, of which there are thousands, and of which, of course, Stephanie is one of the great experts in reading both the Akkadian and Sumerian languages embedded in this cuneiform script, to reveal the reality of a city which is as exciting, as important, and as dramatic as any of those earlier stories that still live with us. So it's a book that brings the real city to real life.
Thank you. Over to you.
I hope you'll forgive me if I am much more self-indulgent than the two great scholars who have spoken before me, because as has been emphasised, I'm not in any way a specialist in this field, but I think that maybe it's precisely the fact that I'm not a specialist that will make my response to this book interesting for the general reader, perhaps, because like a lot of general readers, I bring all kinds of preconceptions and indeed possibly misconceptions to the study of Babylon. And my understanding of the city is a kind of accumulation of images, of ideas, of readings, of concepts that reflect a lifelong interest in it. And it may be because I haven't studied it with any, academically, that the memories I have of Babylon from my childhood are particularly vivid, remain particularly vivid in my mind in a way that perhaps often kind of blot out a more scholarly understanding. So I was very, very interested in biblical stories. And so my understanding of Babylon was profoundly shaped by my interest in the Old Testament stories. I absolutely had a sense of Babylon as a city of wickedness, and that was precisely what made it so interesting to me. And I have to say, I'm ashamed to say, I was very much on the side of the Babylonians as opposed to the Judeans. I thought that they seemed much more glamorous and appealing. My grandmother also had a great collection of books of mythology, and she had a book of Mesopotamian mythology, which I absolutely adored. So this provided a kind of a substratum on which all my future readings about Babylon were raised. One of the books that was mentioned, Persian Fire, was a book about the Greco-Persian Wars, but that I wrote about Cyrus. I wrote about the comings of the Persians to Babylon. So I did have a kind of immersion in the history of 6th century Babylon. Then I then my most recent book actually is a book about the history of Christianity called Dominion. And so I wrote I was reflecting quite a lot, not about the city of Babylon, but about the uses that it's been put by Christian and post-Christian culture, right the way from, I suppose, St. John of Patmos, right the way up to Bob Marley. And then most recently, at the beginning of this year, I co-host a podcast, and we do all kinds of different subjects. And we did two episodes on Babylon. So we did the early history of Babylon, and then we did the age of Nebuchadnezzar and the fall of Babylon. And that required me to do the kind of in-depth research that we do for each podcast, namely a couple of days in-depth reading. So that required me to take out all my general histories of Babylon, which kind of reach back to the 70s, and I kind of read them all through. And it's very interesting reading books that are written by great scholars that are nevertheless aimed at a general reader, because they provide a very, very good way of gauging how the understanding of the discipline has changed and evolved. And that's why I cannot recommend this book too highly for anyone who may have even a casual interest in Babylon, but for someone who may be very interested in the subject but hasn't done a degree in Akkadian or whatever. This is absolutely the book to read, because it is a kind of, it's taking a temperature of the current state of opinion on it. And I was very, very alert to it, having read all the previous general surveys and seeing exactly all the things that I got wrong in the podcast and that you then corrected me. So it's fantastic because it the way it's structured, you have an overview of the history, which I think is the best, short introduction to the history of Babylon that I think I've ever read. You have a survey of the history of discovery, which I've read lots about, but I couldn't believe I never realised that only 3% of the city within the Great Walls has been excavated. I mean, that's so much yet to discover. So I imagine in 10 years you'll have to rewrite it perhaps quite comprehensively. Who knows? And the passage you read absolutely highlights the sense in which you say that this, the past 10, 15 years has been a period where there's been a dramatic acceleration in the pace and scale of new discoveries. And what I was confidently in February when I was doing my podcast on Babylon was saying, this collapse after Hammurabi, I now learn, well, no, not at all. And that kind of, the sense in which our understanding of these very, very ancient kings, these very ancient dynasties, these very ancient civilizations, this is one question I wanted to ask you. To what extent do you think the archaeology enables us to arrive at even a remote approximation of the relative status, say, of the kings or the different periods of civilization, the periods of wealth or security or whatever? Thinking of Hammurabi, famous, of course, the archetype of a Mesopotamian king, because I guess we found his, the French took his law code that had been nicked by the Elamites from Babylon long before, so a constant process of looting, I guess. Do we rate Hammurabi as we do? Do we think of him as the great figure that he might have been simply because we have the happenstance that we have this law code? Or do you think, objectively speaking, he really was, the great figure that he is portrayed as in histories? Does he have the standing that he does simply because of the accident, the serendipity of an archaeological find, or does that reflect an objective standing that a historian can say, yes, he really was this significant figure? So that's one question I had to ask. The other thing that is really kind of eye-opening for me was the degree to which Babylonian civilization lasts and endures after the Persian conquest. It brilliantly portrays Cyrus as pretty much a continuation of all these previous dynasties that had, the Kassites, and my favourite, the Amorites. And you cast Darius the Great perhaps as the supreme disruptor in Babylonian history, but that right the way through the Persian period, the Hellenistic period, the Parthian period, Babylonian civilization is carrying on. And this brings me to one last question that I had, which is that in 2016 I went to Kurdistan to make a film about the Yazidis, and we went to to Lalish, which is the great center of the great temple for the Yazidis, and it's an incredibly syncretic place. You have Jewish, Christian, Muslim, Zoroastrian influences, but there was a room there where that they said was sacred to someone they called Sheikh Shams, who was associated with the sun. And they didn't really know anything more about him, but just that he was a very significant figure, and that he was in some way associated with the sun, and he was in some way associated with the bringing of order. And I wondered, is there any? You don't go beyond really into the Christian and the Muslim period, but I wondered, might there be in any way a possibility that is a kind of living continuation from Babylonian culture, and so might there, to that extent, still be a trace element of Babylon that is still alive in the Near East to this day? But as I say, so those are the two questions I had. Oh no, one other question. Anyone who's familiar with Stephanie's career will know that she wrote a brilliant book about the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, or are they the Hanging Gardens of Babylon? You've brilliantly suggested that they're actually in Nineveh. You don't you kind of hint elliptically at that question in this book. I wonder, do you still think the Hanging Gardens of Babylon are the Hanging Gardens of Nineveh? That's my third question.
Right, well, I'll start with the back before I forget what all these questions
Yeah, sorry.
I've written them down, so we'll return.
I'll need a prompt from time to time.
Yeah.
Okay, yes, the Hanging Gardens, I think, are slowly making their way into acceptability. In fact, I've just been asked to look at a book that's about to be published where that is stated in black and white, which was to my great relief. And I didn't want to repeat what I'd said in my earlier book about the Hanging Garden in Nineveh, except to briefly say what the problem was with putting it in Babylon. I'd just like to mention that a very good director of antiquities in Iraq said that Babylon was a city destroyed by legends, which I think is right. And with some of the books that have the title Babylon, you get the whole history of, well, the first perhaps 1,500 years, because they end early, in 3 pages.
Well, you do have this wonderful chapter that's titled The Next 6 Centuries, which I think is one of the all-time great chapter headings.
Yes, I couldn't resist it, and I thought, well, if I can't resist it, maybe other people will like it, and I'm glad to hear it. They don't think, oh no, another 600 years, because it is a very long period, and of course with the book I was trying to make it not that big, not 5 volumes, and the editor said, please don't put in too many footnotes and bibliography, because that does make the book seem a bit more forbidding than it already is. Now, where shall I go backwards from there?
We've dealt with question 3. Sorry, did you want to?
Well, I was going to say maybe the continuation
The
possibility
yes.
of.
Well, I was very anxious to find how to define the end of my book. And that was the end of cuneiform, because that's what I do, that's my expertise. And the problem really with looking for subsequent material is that you don't have documents preserved anywhere. People have started to write on papyrus or parchment, and it's an organic material and it does not survive. People have stopped writing, by and large, on stone. There are, of course, some exceptions. And with some of the great cities, and I mentioned briefly that the Palmyrene merchants made a stone inscription that mentioned Babylon at a period when people thought it was dead, and it was clearly not. It was clearly still important in their trade. So that was one thing. The archaeology, which you mentioned, is a huge problem, I think. Everything was built in mud brick, and mud brick, by and large, turns to mud when it gets wet. Babylon was built, it's quite high up on a citadel, but every time you build a heavy building, like a ziggurat with 7 stages on it, the water table around it rises, and you get a problem with the adjacent buildings. So then they flood, and then you have to raise the floor level, and you rebuild, and you rebuild, and you rebuild, and you rebuild. And every time you destroy or you reuse the material from the older building, but there's nothing left for the archaeologists. And you look at the big buildings in Babylon, and it's frankly a nightmare. You just don't have the stratigraphy and the dating that you need in order to tell any kind of a story from it. So I didn't try to do a job on the architecture really of Babylon, because not least the tops of the buildings aren't preserved. The upper stories of the buildings aren't preserved. The tops of the walls aren't preserved. And my colleague Olaf Pedersen has done an excellent job of using CGI type graphics to show the buildings. But, you know, he's decided he's got to have crenellations on the top. Were they there? We don't know. He's decided that the crenellations were all dark blue. lapis lazuli type glazing. We don't know that that's true. We just haven't got the evidence. And that's very frustrating. So I tried very hard to write a book that only said what we do know, and that's from the cuneiform texts. So I'm sorry that I can't fill in your gap after the end of cuneiform for the sun god, whose name is Shamash, or Samas, or Samsu in the various dialects of Akkadian. But it's certainly the same word much later on. But what it means, that word, you've got to allow words to change their meaning a bit over time, and you've got to be quite careful about that. In the case of Hammurabi, which you brought up, and this serendipitous find of the great law code, which is in the Louvre, it is immensely impressive. Most of the objects from Babylon are very small, and the script is very small, and they're not very impressive if you know, however well you light them and all that kind of thing, which museum people are always trying to make the most of them. But they, you know, you can't just peer over and see what the writing says. So how much Hammurabi was really, in the way that we think of him now as the most famous of the indigenous rulers, is based, I think, very largely on that monument, because it's big and because it's got a full law code on it. But we now have several much earlier law codes, and it's a question, as with the Epic of Creation, which I discuss in the book, the law codes go from an early version to a later version to a later version and to a later version, and then Hammurabi. Now, what Hammurabi does is to get that as the text taught in all the schools. That's what really pushes out the older versions. And with the centralization of culture in Babylon, his law code becomes the big one. So everybody knows it. We know that from absolutely direct quotations 1,000 years later, which is amazing. And I've just recently been looking at something in the 7th century BC where the king wants a copy of a letter written by Hammurabi, because the one he's got a copy of the letter written by Hammurabi, but it's in awful bad condition, and he'd like a better copy, please. So they send off to Babylon and get it. That means that Babylon, 1,000 years later than the life of Hammurabi, you can still get copies of his letters. Goodness. Did we know that before? No, we didn't. And I find that kind of thing is marvelous, because it shows their value of tradition, but it also shows how important Hammurabi was, even at that period.
I wondered if I could ask you both. I mean, you mentioned this scholar in the Kassite era who was so famous that scholars were claiming descent from him thousands of years later.
Yes.
And this way in which, centuries, millennia on, people are doing basically what you're doing. They're collecting things and putting them in museums. They're looking at these ancient texts. They're trying to kind of source original material. Do you feel a kind of sense of correspondence with these scholars of, say, in the age of Nabonidus or whatever?
Yes, in a way. And one of the things that I felt most about it was when it was discovered that they actually weren't rated very highly, the scholars. They weren't paid very much, and they were sort of kept in their place doing their scholarship rather than becoming, influencers or, well, they did influence, of course, but rather than being stars in a public sense. I think it's quite a tight circle of scholars, and there's endless arguments, of course, about how many people were literate and what literacy means and what level of literacy you might expect. And it's very hard to answer questions of that kind. But, occasionally we get a little peek at Ashurbanipal, the king of Assyria, having a go at writing cuneiform, and we've got a tablet which we reckon was probably written by him. It's not very well done.
Well, he's shown with his pen, isn't he?
Oh yes, that's right. He has his stylus tucked into his belt. That's right. So he reckons he can do it himself. You know, he's up with the scholars in a way.
Perhaps I can pick up on that question and ask you, Paul, a version of Tom's question. In other words, do you see yourself as, in a sense, continuing the work of the early scholars and maybe even collectors, or at least curators, shall we say, of the tradition? And if so, I'll put my own spin on this. How does all that stand in relation to what you yourself mentioned and others have mentioned as a kind of history of looting and of kind of taking from as well as simply carrying on? So perhaps a few thoughts on that in relation to your work, but also in relation to the kind of history that Stephanie outlines here.
Yeah, I think in many ways, these last 20 years, when these tablets are being translated and understood and mined for information, has also been around thinking about what the scholars themselves were trying to do with their texts. So, yes, passing them down through the generations, canonizing certain texts because they were valued and carried on. But I think we are, I think, and Stephanie can correct me here, getting a real insight now into sort of the intellectual thinking of these scholars and how very different they are than the sorts of things all of us here are doing today, about thinking about the past. And the past, certainly I think from the second millennium BC, so from the time of Hammurabi, becomes incredibly important in Mesopotamian thinking. And of course, they're very conscious of their past because precisely their buildings are built on top of each other. So when they come to put a new building up, they clear away the old one, leaving something of the foundations on which, of course, they will then build the next structure. So you have a succession through time of buildings. And the kings and the priests would leave in the foundations of the buildings inscribed objects. Some objects uninscribed, but very often tablets on stone or other materials, as records of the moment of building. So that when you come to rebuild, they might be discovered. And you then have a sense of a succession back through time of lists of kings, essentially. And that, in a way, then becomes part of the way in which they imagine the world. So we have famous documents like the Sumerian king list, of which the Ashmolean has a wonderful example, which is a list of kings stretching back from the moment that the document is created, back through time into a mythological past to the moment of creation, essentially, when the gods lower kingship from heaven. And that's the same idea, succession of cities and their rulers over time. So this idea of listing and time becomes important. And then the objects that are, of course, associated with those moments of time then suddenly take on a new value. And so by the time you get to the end of the second millennium BC, kings are collecting objects and curating them from around Mesopotamia because they're historic. They represent that connection with not just the distant past, but the origins of civilization itself. And indeed, Hammurabi's code was among a collection of objects looted from various cities in Babylonia, taken to Susa in Iran, excavated by the French, and ended up in the Louvre. But that sequence, what the French archaeologists wanted, of course, was to reconstruct a history and think about the reality of the individuals. That's not what the ancients were interested in. They were interested in these objects as connecting them to the moment when the gods created civilization. So I think that has been what, again, coming out of all the texts that Stephanie has been working on enable us to rethink our understanding of the past.
Could I just, I mean, following up on that, because one of the things that comes out brilliantly in the book is the degree to which, say, in Babylon, people are not just appropriating the physical objects of the past, but they're appropriating the history of earlier cities. So Babylon comes to claim the mantle of Uruk as the first city, and so on. To what extent does that complicate your project of writing a history? The sense that the Babylonian scribes are kind of queering the pitch for any objective chronological account quite badly.
Oh, yes. I mean, this is only for the city of Babylon, because I thought if I brought Uruk in as well and 10 other cities, you know, volumes, and I'd never have finished it anyway. You just have to focus. And I think that a lot of books that have Babylon in their title haven't focused on Babylon at all. They've gone off, you know, oh, well, I know a bit about this, I'll chuck it in. A bit about that, and I'll chuck it in. And I find that very unsatisfactory. But to go back to what Paul was talking about, it is interesting that scribes were taught the script that had been used much earlier. Now, you'll know that if you look at German Gothic, or even if you look at Chaucer, it's quite tricky to read the handwriting. Okay, so you have to teach people to read those earlier versions of the script. And that's what the scribes had to practice. And they got old statue bases and they copied them. And some of the history that we've got comes from copied statue bases of long gone statues. Mm-hmm. And they're learning to do old script as well as, you know, today's method of doing it.
To that degree, then, your earlier point, Tom, about the degree to which things are, what we know of the past is about the accident of archaeology, connects with textual history and scribal history and supplements it. And to some degree, even, I was listening to what you were saying, Paul, they're not only responding to the past, they're also preparing for future readers of their civilization, to some degree at least, by appropriating the past, but also setting out, we'll set out this history, not only for now, but for some sort of future. Is that likely? I mean, are we thinking that they're also preparing, not necessarily for you to come along and find them, but that at least they know that they're constructing a story that will go on, that will survive them?
Yes, they've got their legacy in mind,
yes,
as you might say. But there's also an element of how a king can have his kingship revoked by heaven any moment. And that's one of the things that keeps them going on the straight.
Yes.
I mean, there's another one, which I'll tell you in a minute. Where have I got to? No, one of the things I think that I wanted to recommend for Tony Blair, actually, is that you have a joker at court who can tell you what they really think in a way that none of the toadies can. And that's one way of looking at it. But as far as writing for the future is concerned, you are also reporting back to the gods through your writing. And I think that's an important aspect of it. And that, so you're showing that you have kept order in society. You don't reveal your mistakes or the bad things that happen in your reign, except very, very exceptionally and for a particular reason. So you're getting the best face put upon it, which is natural enough.
I mean, what struck me more powerfully, I think, than any other account of Babylonian history that I've read was parallels with China, actually. And you kind of a hint of the mandate of heaven, you know, the ruler losing the favour of the heavens, but also the way in which, presumably, the way that Babylonian culture is absorbing the history of previous cities and making it part of their own, in turn makes it easier for Kassites or even Persians or Assyrians to feel that they also have a stake in it. And that also, I mean, there's a kind of perhaps an echo there of Chinese history, the way that China has constantly been conquered but remains China in a way that, say, the Roman Empire didn't, or, you know, or Egypt always remains Egyptian up until It's harder for foreign invaders to brand themselves as Egyptian, it seems, than it was for barbarian invaders to brand themselves as Babylonian.
I think it was very easy to assimilate into Babylonian society as long as you accepted all their sort of rituals and things. And until the monotheisms come along, there's not a problem about that. You know, the sun god is a great god. Everybody's got a sun. It's the same sun wherever you go. And I think that helped with the assimilation of beliefs and rituals, probably. And the constellations. And that's one area where you definitely do get the transition from Babylonian through the period of no sources to coming out the other end, when some of the constellations in Arabic and in Greek have the same names as they do in Babylonian. You get Scorpion. Scorpio is a constellation through all those different languages and coming out at the end, and it still is Scorpio. So that's an example then of the continuity, and I did want in the book very much to show the continuity, but by contrast with the Chinese, who think, you know, if you're speaking or writing Chinese script, you're pure Han. They don't do anything of that in Babylonia. People assimilate, and if they assimilate enough, they are Babylonians. There's not a feeling of nationalism based on language.
Because I thought you incredible, I mean, revelatory about the Kassites, who are such as kind of shadowy figures, but you give them such a heft in the book.
Yes, well, you know, I was driven to a fury by people saying, well, you know, Cyrus was the first person to come from outside and take charge of the country. No, this has happened before.
Yeah,
we've had Sumerians, we've had Amorites, your favourite people. I must ask you about that. And we've got Kassites, and we've got Arameans, and then we've got Cyrus, whether you call him a Persian or a... But one of the things about when we get the Persian element coming in, what people very seldom remember is that the Persians come in as illiterate. They do not have their own written language until Darius makes a break and changes that. But even then, all the records are not kept in Old Persian at Persepolis, and there's no evidence for continuity in Babylonian epic literature in Persian, later Persian literature. It's extraordinary.
Talking of continuity, part of my job is to keep an eye on the time. We promised you the chance to do a second reading from the book, and I'd like to invite you to do that in just a second. We normally also ask if anybody in the audience has a particularly burning question they would like to ask any of our panel. If not, you can wait till we've finished, and we'll have a chat sort of after officially closing. But if there is anybody who's got a particular question they want to ask, yes, please do.
I suppose the British Museum is the biggest collection in the UK, and the Ashmolean is second afterwards.
So here in Oxford?
In Oxford. Berlin is very well furnished with things from Babylon, but the British Museum has a huge amount because so much was looted before there were excavations there. So people were buying from dealers in Baghdad in the 18th century.
One other answer, if only 3% of the stuff has been excavated, is still under the ground, I guess. But it is a serious answer, but it also means that there's still, as we said right at the beginning, so much that we don't know.
Known unknowns.
The known unknowns, as the Iraq War told us. The second question was about...
Can I just mention the Louvre in Paris
Yes.
is the other place where you find very good collections of Babylonian objects.
How much has been recovered from the National Museum of Iraq in Baghdad
Oh,
after the looting?
a lot. I mean, some stuff was too heavy to take. And the cylinder seals were particularly badly done because it's easy to pocket them, I suppose, when looters run in. And some of the stuff was retrieved and, in fact, turned out to have been taken into secure custody by the faithful people who ran the museum. So it's not all a bad story, and I think now with some of the objects in the West being returned to Baghdad, I think they've got a splendid museum, which I'm hoping maybe I'll get to see. But I was shocked to see on television how that man who went to Iraq recently...
Oh, the man who got arrested?
No, this is, oh gosh, what's his name? Palin.
Michael Palin.
He didn't even go to the museum when he was in Baghdad. And if you really want to see what Baghdad's about, you should go to the museum. So do all go. Go to Babylon and see. But, you know, it's much more exciting, the museum, than Babylon, because it's just decayed mud brick. And it's not great to look around.
There's a few, I mean, the reconstruction of the lowest parts of the Ishtar Gate are still there. You can walk through that. And then there's several temples reconstructed.
Yes.
So you get a sense of scale.
Well, that's
and
great.
I think, and then that 3% then comes home.
Yes.
When you look across the flat landscape. So well worth a visit, I would say.
On a hot day,
Yeah.
maybe that's enough to look at anyway.
That's probably true.
We should give you the last word, and if you'd like to read a second passage from the book as a final taster, please do, and then we shall draw things to a close.
Well, one of the things that I was anxious not to do, but I'm wondering whether I was right about that, is to do with seeing Babylon as an exception in cities, becoming an exception, rather like the Vatican in Rome among the rest of the city of Rome and all the other cities of Roman Catholic faith. And here we get, I better not say that. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the last existing building of Nebuchadnezzar II. The Summer Palace was still a place to visit where the ghost of Alexander the Great lingered. In AD 116, the Roman Emperor Trajan briefly took control of Babylonia and paid a visit to Babylon in order to pay homage to the place where his great hero Alexander had died. The hero's body, embalmed by Egyptians in Babylon, had eventually been taken to Alexandria in Egypt, but knowledge of his deathbed in Babylon still lived on, 439 years later. Trajan had gone there, I quote, both because of its fame, though he saw nothing but mounds and stones and ruins to justify this, and because of Alexander, whose spirit he offered sacrifice in the room where he had died. Babylon, therefore, had become a place of pilgrimage dedicated to the Macedonian king of Babylon, and the design of the antefixes on the new Greek-style roof there predates Trajan's visit by at least 2 centuries, which suggests that pilgrims were already coming long before he came to make his offering. The foreign visitor could still enter the palace of Nebuchadnezzar II and make a sacrifice there. So,
Thank you. So we ourselves have all been foreign visitors, effectively, to pick up on that today. But I would like to thank, on behalf of everyone here, our expert guides, Paul Collins, Tom Holland, and of course Stephanie Dalley. Thank you so much for today's Book at Lunchtime.
Thank you.